Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through history. As you settle in for a restful slumber or a moment of quiet relaxation, I invite you to let your mind wander with me to a distant time and place. Before we embark on our trip into the harsh realities of everyday life in medieval Europe, I'd love to know where you're joining me from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and say hello. And if you enjoy these soothing historical tales from the past, I encourage you to subscribe for more calming storytelling. Tonight, we'll be venturing back to the age of kings and queens, knights and peasants, grand castles and humble villages. A time that captivates the imagination, but was also filled with immense challenges and hardships for the average person. Yes, we're talking about medieval Europe, a period spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries. But before we dive into the gritty realities of life during those times, let's ease in with a deep breath and allow ourselves to be transported back to a typical village in the European countryside, somewhere around the 12th century. Picture in your mind's eye a small cluster of simple houses, more like huts with mud and straw walls and thatched roofs. Smoke rises from the chimneys as the inhabitants begin to stir and start their day. Chickens peck at the ground, and pigs root around in the muddy streets. Their grunts and snuffles mingle with the bleating of sheep in the pastures beyond. The air is filled with the earthy scent of animals, wood smoke, and the slightly acrid tang of the tanner's work. In the distance, the Lord's manor house and the spire of the village church rise above the trees. It's a rustic scene, perhaps even charming to our modern sensibilities. But the quaintness belies the difficult realities faced by the people who called this place home. For the average peasant, life was a constant struggle against hunger, disease, back-breaking labor, and the oppressive weight of the feudal system that bound them to the land and made them beholden to their noble masters. As the sun rose and the rooster crowed, we focus on a particular family. A weathered, careworn man, his wife with a baby at her breast, and their brood of children rose from their straw mattresses to face another day of toil. Little did they know that today would bring challenges and heartbreak beyond their usual hardships. John, the father, stretched his aching muscles as he stepped out into the chilly morning air. He dreaded the long hours ahead, working the land he rented from the local lord. He knew his wife Anne would have her hands full with the little ones, grinding grain to make bread, tending the garden, and feeding the animals. The children, too, would be put to work as soon as they were old enough to walk and carry a bucket. There was no time for play when every pair of hands was needed to ensure the family's survival. Even the eldest daughter, at 12 years old, knew she would likely be married off soon to relieve her parents' burden and forge an advantageous alliance with another family. As John and his older sons headed out to the fields, let's pause to consider what their lives were truly like. They toiled under the scorching sun and the watchful eye of the Lord's reeve. Subsistence farming was no easy task in an era before modern machinery and agricultural techniques. Their tools were primitive, clumsy wooden plows, scythes to cut the wheat, and flails to thresh the grain. The work was backbreaking, the days long, and the rewards meager. A good harvest meant just enough to feed the family and pay the required portion to the Lord, leaving little to sell or trade. A bad harvest, however, could spell disaster, leading to an inability to pay the rent and taxes, resulting in hunger, or even eviction from the land that was their sole livelihood. And the constant spectre of illness and injury loomed large. A broken bone, an infected cut, a bout of fever or flux, any of these could spell death in a time before antibiotics and modern medicine. John himself had lost 2 brothers in infancy, and his father had succumbed to a coughing sickness that left him weakened and struggling for breath. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, John and his sons continued their arduous labor, pausing only for a meager midday meal of coarse bread and cheese. The blisters on their hands oozed, and their backs ached, but they dared not rest for too long, lest they fall behind in their work and incur the wrath of the Lord or his reeve. The reeve, a peasant like them, was set apart by his role in overseeing the manor's lands and assigning duties to the serfs. Some reeves were fair-minded, striving to balance the needs of the peasants with the demands of the Lord. However, many, intoxicated by their limited power, became petty tyrants, doling out punishments and abuse with a heavy hand. As the long day wore on, let us turn our attention to a particular reeve, a stern man named Thomas. Thomas fancied himself superior to the common rabble, boasting of his slightly finer tunic and his self-important air. He revelled in lauding his authority over the peasants under his command, meting out beatings for the slightest perceived infraction or disrespect. On this day, Thomas had his sights set on John, who was struggling to keep up with the pace in the fields. The harvest had been poorer than anticipated this year, and John's youngest child had fallen ill with a fever, demanding more of Anne's time and attention. Consequently, John had fallen behind in his assigned quota of bushels, and Thomas was determined to make an example of him. "You there, John?" Thomas bellowed, striding over to where John was working. "Why are you lagging behind? Do you think the Lord's granaries will fill themselves?" John kept his eyes down, understanding that any hint of defiance would only escalate the situation. "Apologies, sir," he mumbled. "My child has been unwell." Thomas cut him off with a sneer. "Your wife, your child, your aching back. You surfers are full of excuses, but the Lord doesn't care about your troubles. He expects his due portion, and it's my job to ensure he receives it." With that, Thomas gestured to one of his underlings, a burly man with a cudgel at his belt. 10 lashes, I believe, to encourage better work ethic, and a double portion owed from his harvest to compensate for his laziness. John felt his stomach drop as rough hands seized him and dragged him to the whipping post at the edge of the field. He knew this punishment would leave him unable to work for days, and the double portion would mean starvation for his family this winter. However, he also understood that any resistance would only lead to harsher retribution for himself and his loved ones. The witch trials of the medieval era were a particularly dark and tragic chapter in human history. Across Europe, thousands of people, predominantly women, were accused of practicing witchcraft and subjected to brutal interrogations, torture, and executions. The sad tale of the lonely old woman ostracized by her village was all too common. She had lived on the outskirts of town for as long as anyone could remember. With no family to care for her, she relied on the charity of neighbors, trading herbal remedies and midwifery skills for meager scraps of food. But as she aged and grew more isolated, whispers began to spread. When crops failed or livestock fell ill, suspicious eyes turned toward the old woman and her strange concoctions. Children were warned not to stray near her dilapidated hovel, lest she lure them in with a curse. As fear and rumor took hold, accusations of witchcraft spread like wildfire. One day, a mob of angry villagers arrived at her door, led by the self-righteous parish priest. They dragged the terrified old woman before a hastily assembled tribunal where she was accused of coveting the devil and casting wicked spells. No amount of pleading or professing innocence could sway the bloodthirsty crowd. The trial, if one could call it that, was a farce. Dubious evidence and hearsay were presented as irrefutable proof of her guilt. When she refused to confess, even under duress, they had all the justification they needed. The sentence was passed: death by drowning. On a grey, drizzly morning, the old woman was bound hand and foot and carted to the river's edge. A priest offered her a final chance at absolution if she would only admit her crimes, but she remained defiantly silent. With a nod from the baith, she was pushed into the frigid, swirling waters. As the life drained from her frail body, the villagers watched with a mix of satisfaction and horror. Some claimed to see dark spirits fleeing from her corpse, confirming their righteous judgment. Others simply turned away, eager to put the grim business behind them and return to their daily toils. In the end, the old woman's fate was sealed not by any genuine evil on her part, but by the fear, ignorance, and cruelty of a society all too ready to scapegoat its most vulnerable members. Her tragic story played out countless times in medieval Europe, as innocent lives were snuffed out in the name of religious fervor and mob justice. The lack of education and scientific understanding in the Middle Ages allowed such superstitions and paranoia to take deep root. For the average peasant laborer, there was little opportunity to learn beyond the most rudimentary of skills passed down by their elders. Reading and writing were privileges reserved for the wealthy and the clergy. In a world lit only by fire, where the forces of nature held sway over crops and health, it was all too easy to attribute misfortune to the work of evil spirits or malevolent neighbors. Without the tools to comprehend their arduous and challenging existence, people clung to folklore and the limited teachings of the church. Priests and monks, in turn, were often more preoccupied with maintaining their own power and influence than spreading enlightenment to the masses. They jealously guarded their monopoly on knowledge, sharing only snippets of wisdom and dictating the course of village life as they deemed fit. For a humble farmer or tradesman, challenging this entrenched order was unthinkable. The best one could hope for was to learn their prayers, pay their tithes, and maintain the favor of the local authorities. Deviating from the norm or drawing undue attention was a sure path to ruin. Consequently, for generations the people of medieval Europe remained trapped in a cycle of poverty, superstition, and oppression. The glimmer of learning would eventually break through the gloom with the rise of universities and the spread of the printing press in the later Middle Ages. However, that brighter future must have seemed impossibly distant to the huddled masses toiling in the fields and muddy streets. Their days were an endless cycle of back-breaking labor, punctuated by the occasional wedding, religious festival, or public execution. Simple pleasures, a hearty meal, a warm fire, and a kind word from a friend took on immense significance in a world with so little comfort or diversion. Even in the darkest of times, the human spirit endured. Mothers and fathers continued to love their children fiercely. Neighbors came together to face hardships, and even the lowest of souls dared to dream of a better life, if not in this world, than the next. These were the people who laid the foundation of modern Europe, brick by brick and seed by seed. Although they may be long forgotten as individuals, their struggles and sacrifices resound through the centuries. We who enjoy the fruits of their labor owe them a profound debt of gratitude. So let us return now to that humble peasant family we encountered at the beginning of our tale. As they lay down to sleep after another grueling day, their bellies growling and their limbs heavy with exhaustion, they find solace in the bonds of kinship and community that sustain them. The father pulls his cloak tightly against the biting night air and whispers a prayer for a bountiful harvest. The mother gathers her little ones close, grateful to have weathered another season, and the children drift off to sleep, their minds filled not with the cares of the day, but with the eternal childhood dreams of adventure and possibility. In the dying embers of the hearth fire, we glimpse the faint promise of the world to come, a world of greater knowledge, prosperity, and freedom that their descendants will one day inherit. A world that they themselves helped to build through their toil, tears, and quiet, unsung acts of love and resilience. And so we bid good night to our medieval forebears, secure in the knowledge that their legacy lives on within us. Rest well, weary travelers of ages past. Your story is our story, and it shall never be forgotten. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows across the manor's fields, the weary peasant family trudges back to their humble dwelling. The father, his hands calloused and dirt-caked from a day of ploughing, leads the way, followed closely by his wife. A basket of meager vegetables rests on her hip. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, trail after them, their bare feet leaving imprints in the soft earth. The family's one-room hut offers little comfort after a long day of labor. The thatched roof leaks when it rains, and the walls are drafty in the winter. A single straw mattress shared by the entire family lies in the corner. The mother starts a small fire in the hearth and begins to prepare a simple stew of turnips, onions, and a scrap of salted pork. It's a substantial meal, but it will have to sustain them until the morning. As the children huddle around the flickering flames, the father regales them with stories passed down through generations. He recounts tales of valiant knights and beautiful maidens, of dragons and sorcerers. For a fleeting moment, the family escapes their hardships, transported to a realm of enchantment and adventure. However, reality soon returns as a chilling breeze sweeps through the cracks in the walls. The family's struggles are not unique. Across the land, countless peasant families endure similar hardships. They form the backbone of the feudal system, tirelessly working day in and day out to support the opulent lifestyles of the nobility. Yet, their lives are not their own. They are bound to the land, subject to the whims of their lord and the capricious nature of the environment. One such peasant was a man named John Atwood, born in the early 14th century in a small village in England. John was the son of a farmer. From a young age, he learned the rhythms of the land, planting and harvesting crops in harmony with the changing seasons. As was customary, he married young and started a family. However, John's life took a dire turn when his village was struck by the devastating Black Death. The plague arrived on the backs of rats, swiftly spreading through the close-knit community. John witnessed in horror as his neighbors fell ill, their bodies racked with fever and covered in oozing black boils. Tragically, his own wife and two of his children succumbed to the disease, leaving him alone with his infant son. In the aftermath of the plague, John faced immense challenges in keeping his farm afloat. With the death of so many, there was a severe shortage of labor, and the lord of the manor demanded even more from the surviving peasants. John worked tirelessly from dawn till dusk, his hands blistered and his back aching, but it was never enough. When he could no longer pay his rent, the lord's men seized his last cow, leaving him with no means to feed his son. Desperation and anger consumed John, leading him to join a group of peasants who were plotting a revolt against their lord. They met in secret, whispering of freedom and justice, but their plan was discovered, and John was captured and brought before the lord for punishment. In the depths of the manor, John endured unimaginable torture, his body broken and his spirit shattered. Upon his release, he emerged as a changed man. Returning to his farm, he found joy in the simple pleasures of life elusive. His son, now a young boy, attempted to comfort him, but John was haunted by the memories of his ordeal. Withdrawal and bitterness consumed him, lashing out at those around him. As the years passed, John's health declined. His once strong hands were gnarled with arthritis, his eyesight dimmed, and his hearing faded. He spent his days by the fire, staring into the flames and muttering to himself. Despite his son's best efforts to care for him, John was lost in his own world of pain and sorrow. One cold winter morning, John's son discovered him slumped over in his chair, his eyes closed and his breathing shallow. John had passed away in the night, his suffering finally at an end. The village priest performed a brief prayer over his body before it was laid to rest in the frozen ground. There was no headstone to mark his grave, only a simple wooden cross that would soon decay. John Atwood's story serves as a testament to the hardships faced by the common people of medieval Europe. It paints a picture of poverty, disease, and oppression, of lives cut short by the cruelty of fate and the indifference of those in power. Yet, it also highlights the resilience of the human spirit, its ability to endure even the darkest of times. As we reflect on this period of history from the comfort of our modern lives, it is easy to romanticize the past, envisioning a world of chivalry and romance, of knights in shining armor and damsels in distress. However, the reality was far more stark. For the vast majority of people, life was a constant struggle, a battle against hunger, disease, and the whims of those in power. Even the aristocracy, with their fine clothes and lavish banquets, was not immune to the hardships of the time. They too endured disease and malnutrition, constantly threatened by violence and political upheaval. Despite their wealth and power, they were still bound by the rigid social hierarchy of the feudal system, their lives dictated by the expectations of their rank and station. In the grand scheme of history, the medieval period may appear distant and alien, but in many ways, the struggles and triumphs of those who lived then are not so different from our own. They too loved and laughed, hoped and dreamed, seeking meaning and purpose even in the face of unimaginable adversity. As the stars twinkle overhead and the world falls into slumber, let us pause to remember the lives of those who came before us, honoring their struggles and sacrifices and learning from their example. For in the end, we are all connected by the unbreakable bonds of our shared humanity across centuries and miles. The peasant family now rests, huddled together for warmth on their straw mattress. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, sorrows, and joys, but for now they find solace in their dreams, a refuge from the hardships of their waking lives. As the night deepens and the fire burns low, the spirits of the past keep watch over them, whispering stories of hope and resilience in the darkness. As the Lord's procession winds its way back to the manor house, our gaze shifts to the serfs' quarters. Smoke rises from the thatched roofs, mingling with the earthy aroma of freshly baked bread. Children dart between the huts, their laughter a fleeting moment of joy amidst the daily grind. In one of these humble dwellings, we find a young boy named Thomas. He sits cross-legged on the dirt floor, intently watching as his father John, carves a wooden spoon with a small knife. John's hands are rough and calloused, a testament to the years of toil in the fields. He looks up at his son with a weary smile. "One day, my son," he softly said, "you'll have your own trade, a way to earn your keep that doesn't involve breaking your back in the fields." Thomas's eyes widened with curiosity. "Like what, father?" John set down his knife and reached for a piece of bread, breaking it in half and handing a portion to his son. "Well, there's the blacksmith, the cooper, the tanner, men who make things with their hands. It's hard work, but it's a different kind of hard than what we do out there," he mused, gesturing towards the fields beyond their door. Thomas chewed thoughtfully, his young mind trying to imagine a life beyond the manor. He had heard stories of the towns that were springing up across the land, places where a man might make his own way in the world. But for now, such dreams felt as distant as the stars. As the sun began to set, John and Thomas made their way to the fields for the final work of the day. They joined the other farmers in the communal strip of land, each family responsible for their own plot. The soil was heavy and thick, clinging to their boots as they walked the furrows. John took up his ox-driven plough, the beast snorting and stamping as it felt the weight of the yoke. Thomas followed behind, scattering seeds from a woven basket hanging at his side. It was back-breaking work. The plough caught on roots and rocks, and the seeds disappeared into the unyielding earth. As they worked, John regaled his son with tales of their ancestors, men and women who had worked this same land for generations. He spoke of their triumphs and their failures, the harsh winters and the bountiful harvests. Thomas listened intently, feeling the weight of history on his young shoulders. But there was one story that John had never told, one that haunted his dreams and gnawed at his waking hours. It was the story of his own father, a man broken by the cruelty of their lord. Thomas's grandfather was a strong man, a skilled farmer who could coax life from even the most stubborn soil. But he was also a proud man, one who resented the injustices of the feudal system. When the lord demanded an extra portion of the harvest one year, leaving the serfs with barely enough to survive, Thomas's grandfather refused. The punishment was swift and brutal. The lord's men dragged the old man before the entire village, his hands bound behind his back. The lord himself delivered the sentence, 30 lashes for disobedience. Thomas's grandfather was stripped to the waist, his weathered skin bared to the cold autumn air. The whip cracked through the air repeatedly, each strike leaving a vivid red line across his back. He gritted his teeth, refusing to cry out, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the manor walls. When it was over, they left him there, bound and bleeding, as a warning to the others. John, just a boy at the time, watched helplessly as his father struggled to stand, his once proud back bent with pain and humiliation. That night, as John helped his mother tend to his father's wounds, he made a silent vow. He would never let the same thing happen to his own family. He would bear the injustices, the back-breaking labor, and the gnawing hunger, all to keep them safe. Now, as he watches Thomas scattering seeds with the carefree enthusiasm of youth, John feels that vow weighing heavily on his heart. He knows that his son deserves a better life, a chance to be more than just another serf tied to the land. But how can he give him that chance when every day is a struggle just to survive? As the sun dips below the horizon, John and Thomas make their way back to the village, their bodies aching with fatigue. The smoke from the fires has died down, replaced by the flicker of tallow candles in the windows. In their own hut, John's wife, Margaret, has laid out a meagre supper of stewed turnips and barley bread. She looks up as they enter, her face lined with worry. "Any news from the manor?" she asks softly, her eyes searching John's face for some sign of hope. John sinks onto the rough-hewn bench, shaking his head as he sighs. The usual demands loom large, more grain for the Lord's table and more hours in the fields. Margaret nods, her shoulders sagging under the weight of their shared burden. She ladles out the thin stew into wooden bowls, her hands trembling slightly. As they eat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, a sudden commotion outside breaks the stillness. John leaps to his feet, instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. But it's not the Lord's men come to deliver another punishment. Instead, a group of villagers, their faces ashen in the flickering candlelight, crowd around the doorway. Their voices rise in a jumble of fear and confusion. John pushes his way through the throng, his heart pounding in his chest. And there, lying in the center of the village square, is a sight that will haunt him for the rest of his days. It's the body of a young man, his skin mottled with dark, oozing lumps. His eyes stare sightlessly at the night sky, his mouth frozen in a retch of pain. The villagers recoil in horror, their hands flying to their faces to ward off the stench of death. John feels a cold dread settle in the pit of his stomach. He's heard the rumors, whispers of a terrible plague sweeping across the land, a pestilence that strikes without warning, leaving entire villages devastated in its wake. As he stares at the lifeless body of the young man, John knows that their lives are about to change forever. The Black Death has come to their village, and nothing will ever be the same again. In the days that follow, the plague spreads like wildfire through the cramped, filthy streets of the village. Families huddle together in their huts, watching helplessly as loved ones succumb to the fever and the chills, the agonizing pain of the swollen, blackened lumps. John and Margaret, determined to protect their son Thomas, keep him close and fervently pray to a seemingly abandoned deity. Despite their best efforts, the relentless march of the pestilence continues unabated. It begins with a cough and a slight fever that they initially dismiss. However, Margaret soon falls into bedridden, her body racked with pain as lumps appear on her skin. John tends to her tirelessly, bathing her fevered brow and whispering comforting words that ring hollow in his own ears. When she finally succumbs to the ravages of the disease, her once bright eyes dimmed by the disease's grip. John feels a part of himself perish with her. He buries her in the small churchyard, where the ground is already crowded with the freshly dug graves of their neighbors. Thomas, his face streaked with tears, clings to his father's leg as the priest delivers the last rites. John holds him close, trying to be strong for his son, even as his own heart crumbles. In the weeks that follow, the village descends into a state of madness. The fields go untended, and the livestock roam freely as their owners succumb to the plague. The lord and his family barricade themselves in the manor house, leaving the survivors to fend for themselves. John and Thomas struggle to make ends meet, foraging for food and praying for their own salvation. The spectre of death looms large over the village, a constant reminder of the fragility of life in this harsh and unforgiving world. As the days stretch into weeks and the weeks into months, the plague begins to lose its hold on the village. The sick and dying are replaced by hollow-eyed survivors, their bodies wasted by hunger and grief. John and Thomas emerge from their hut, blinking in the bright sunlight like creatures from another world. The village stands as a ghost of its former self, the once bustling streets now eerily silent. Yet, amidst this desolation, there are glimmers of hope. The fields, neglected for so long, begin to sprout with new growth. The sound of a baby's cry reverberates through the deserted streets, a testament to the resilience of life even amidst unimaginable tragedy. John, taking Thomas's hand, guides him into the fields. They stand together, surveying the land that has been their livelihood and burden for so long. "We will rebuild," John whispers softly, his voice tinged with emotion. "We will honor those we have lost by living the best lives we can." Thomas nods, his young face etched with a gravity beyond his years. He understands that the road ahead will be arduous, that the scars of the plague will linger long after the last victim has been laid to rest. Yet he also knows that he has his father by his side, a man who has endured unimaginable hardships and emerged victorious. United by the bonds of family and the indomitable human spirit, they brace themselves for whatever challenges lie ahead. As they turn back towards the village, ready to embark on the arduous journey of rebuilding, the sun breaks through the clouds, bathing the land in a warm, golden glow. It's a fleeting moment of beauty in a world that has known immense darkness. But for John and Thomas, it serves as a beacon of hope, a promise that even in the darkest of times there exists the possibility of a brighter tomorrow. Years pass, and gradually, painfully, the village begins to heal. New families settle into the abandoned huts, and the sound of children's laughter once again fills the streets. The fields are planted and harvested, and the rhythm of the seasons reasserts itself in the face of unimaginable loss. John and Thomas work side by side, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Thomas matures into a strong, capable young man, his hands calloused from years of toil in the fields. However, he never forgets the invaluable lessons he learned during those dark days of the plague, the profound importance of family and community in the face of adversity. As he watches his own children play in the village square, Thomas occasionally reflects on that distant conversation with his father, the one about finding a trade of his own. He now understands that there's no escape from the land, no easy path to a better life. However, he also recognizes the honor in their work, the sweat and struggle of coaxing life from the stubborn earth. He takes pride in the calluses on his hands, the ache in his back at the end of a long day. When the Lord calls, demanding his share of the harvest, Thomas meets his gaze with unwavering resolve. He acknowledges the injustices of the system, the cruelty inflicted on those who resist. Yet, he also knows the strength of his spirit, the unbreakable bonds of family and community that have weathered the darkest times. He will bear the burden as his father did before him, so that his own children may one day experience a better life. As the sun sets over the manor house, Thomas makes his way back to his humble dwelling. Inside, his wife has prepared a simple supper, the fruits of their own labor. They dine in companionable silence, their love a warm, steady glow in the flickering candlelight. Later, as they lie in the darkness, Thomas pulls his wife close, feeling the rise and fall of her breathing against his chest. He acknowledges the hardships of their life, filled with uncertainty and sorrow. But he also knows it's a life worth living, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. As he drifts off to sleep, he dreams of a better world, a world where his children's children may one day experience true freedom and prosperity. It's a distant dream, as distant as the stars that wheel overhead in the vast, endless sky. But it's a dream worth holding on to, a glimmer of hope in a world that can sometimes feel hopelessly dark. And so the cycle continues. The seasons turn in their endless dance. The serfs toil and struggle, bearing the weight of an unjust system with quiet, unbreakable dignity. They find joy in the small things, in the love of family and the beauty of a sunset over the fields. Through all the hardships they face, they endure, their spirits unbroken. They are the backbone of this land, the beating heart that keeps it alive even in the darkest times. As we leave this humble village, we carry with us the stories of those who came before, the joys and sorrows that shape their lives. We are reminded of the resilience of the human spirit, the unbreakable bonds of love and community that can see us through even the darkest nights. Though the world may change and empires may rise and fall, these simple truths remain constant, a guiding light in an uncertain world. So, let us hold fast to them, these humble serfs and their quiet, unbreakable strength. For in the end, it is they who will endure long after the lords and ladies have faded into dust. They will carry the torch of hope into a brighter tomorrow, their spirits forever unbroken, forever free. As we close our eyes and drift off into the realm of dreams, we carry with us the echoes of their stories, the whispers of their lives. We are reminded of the beauty and sorrow, the joy and pain that make up the tapestry of human existence. In that moment, we are one with them, these humble serfs of a distant age. Their struggles are our struggles, their triumphs our triumphs. We are bound together by the common threads of love and loss, hope and fear. So, let us rest now, secure in the knowledge that we are part of something greater, a story that stretches back through the ages and will continue long after we are gone. Let us take comfort in the quiet strength of those who came before and in the promise of a better world to come. And as we sleep, let us dream of that world, a world where the chains of oppression are finally broken, where every man, woman, and child may know the joy of true freedom. It is a dream worth holding on to, a dream that will guide us through the darkest of nights and into the light of a new dawn. So, weary traveler, rest now, and let the stories of the past be your lullabies. For in the end, it is the enduring tales of love and loss, hope and heartbreak that echo through the ages. As long as these stories are told, cherished, and held close to our hearts, the spirit of those long-ago surfers will never truly die. They will live on in us, in the quiet strength that carries us through the darkest of times. So, sleep now and dream of a better world, a world where the stories of the past are not forgotten, but woven into the fabric of our own lives. A tapestry of hope and resilience that will endure for generations to come. Let's return now to the young blacksmith's apprentice we met earlier, toiling away long hours in the sweltering forge. His hands are covered in blisters and calluses, his face streaked with soot and sweat. The work is grueling and repetitive, hammering out horseshoes, nails, tools and weapons for the manor and village. But he knows this is his one shot at a better life, a chance to rise above the drudgery of serfdom. The blacksmith is a tough master, quick to cuff the boy's ears for any mistake or slowness. But he also teaches the secrets of the trade, how to heat the metal just so, to fold it repeatedly until it becomes strong and supple. The boy watches in awe as the blacksmith crafts a gleaming sword for the lord, the steel rippling like water in the orange glow of the coals. He dreams that someday his own work will be so fine, so sought after. But the road ahead is long and uncertain. As an apprentice, the boy is little more than an indentured servant bound to his master for years, with only a small stipend for food and lodging. He sleeps on a straw pallet in the back of the forge, rising before dawn to stoke the flames and begin the day's work. His hands never seem to come fully clean of the black soot ground into the cracks and creases. Even if he does complete his apprenticeship and become a journeyman, the future is fraught with challenges. The guilds, with their strict regulations, control who can practice each trade and open their own shops. They set prices, establish quality standards, and impose limits on competition. To advance, the young man must navigate this intricate web of restrictions and politics. He'll face hefty fees, create a masterpiece to showcase his skill, and gain favor with the guild leaders. Many aspiring craftsmen become stuck at this stage, unable to afford the costs of starting a business. If he manages to become a master blacksmith with his own forge, he'll encounter the daily challenges of running a medieval business. He'll need to secure raw materials like iron ore and charcoal controlled by wealthy merchants, attract customers and commissions in a bustling marketplace, haggle over prices and payments, repair and replace tools, hire and manage apprentices, and strive to make a modest living for himself and his family. All this while grappling with the constant threat of disease, injury, and debt. A serious illness could leave him unable to work, with no savings to support him. An accident from a hot forge or sharp metal could result in maiming or even death. A noble customer who refuses to pay for services could drive him to ruin. Without a social safety net, a single unfortunate event could plunge him back into poverty. As the apprentice lies on his lumpy straw mattress at the end of another exhausting day, massaging his aching muscles, he contemplates whether it's all worth it. Being a serf is a grueling and miserable life of back-breaking labor and constant toil, with no prospects of advancement. However, being a craftsman means walking a razor's edge between modest success and destitution. Both paths are fraught with obstacles and suffering. Yet, as his eyes drift closed, succumbing to sleep, the young man can't help but dream of a brighter future. He envisions a shop of his own, a warm fire in the forge, a row of gleaming blades and sturdy tools waiting for delighted customers, a beautiful wife, healthy children, a cozy cottage with glass windows and meat on the table, a little dignity and respect from his fellow man. A life where his sweat and skill actually earned him something more than a crust of bread and a kick from his master. It may be distant, improbable, but it's still a far sweeter dream than any serf sleeping in the muddy fields could claim. The next day, as the apprentice plunges the red-hot metal into the water with a hiss and a cloud of steam, he holds that dream in his mind. He lets it carry him through the aching arms, the burnt fingers, and the scolding from the blacksmith. Like the sword he is learning to forge, hammered, folded, and hammered again. He lets each hardship mold him, shape him, and make him stronger and sharper, perhaps strong enough to cut through the chains of his birth and forge a new path. Only time, toil, and tenacity will tell. As the Black Death ravaged Europe in the mid-4th century, no corner of society was spared. But it was the poor and powerless who suffered the worst. Serfs crammed into fettered hovels, craftsmen laboring in crowded workshops, beggars and street urchins lurking in the alleyways. They were the first to fall ill. Their malnourished bodies offered little resistance to the disease, and they were the last to receive care, medicine, or relief in a world where such things were reserved for the wealthy. Our blacksmith's apprentice watches in horror as the plague creeps ever closer to his village. First, travelers bring rumors of a strange sickness in distant parts, of towns barricading their gates, and of mass graves overflowing with bodies. Then, those who fled the hot zones begin arriving, desperate for food and shelter, some already showing signs of fever and boils. The manor lord orders them turned away, but it's too late. The pestilence slips in silently, a flea riding on a rat, a cough carried on the wind. Soon the first villagers fall ill, a shepherd boy, a washerwoman, a friar. Their families try to conceal their illness, fearing the stigma and isolation it brings. However, the sickness spreads rapidly through the tightly packed huts and streets, making it impossible to keep it a secret. The symptoms are unmistakable and terrifying. Painful egg-sized swellings in the armpits and groin, oozing pus and blood, dark blotches under the skin, indicating internal bleeding, raging fever and vomiting, delirium and anguish. The blacksmith, a strong and vital man, falls ill quickly, his massive body ravaged by the infection. The apprentice, desperate to care for him, brings water to quench his thirst, masks the stench of sickness with herbs, and prays fervently to every saint he knows. But his efforts are futile. Within days, the once strong and vital man is reduced to a shivering, raving wreck, his skin blackened with hemorrhages. He dies in agony, choking on his own bloody bile. The boy barely registers the loss of his master before others in the household fall ill. The blacksmith's wife, his young children, and the other apprentices. One by one, they wither and perish, like flowers shriveling under a merciless sun. The forge goes cold and silent, the tools gathering dust, and the unfinished projects abandoned on the workbench. There are no customers anyway, so the village has become a ghost town. The healthy barricade themselves in their homes while the sick wail in the streets. In desperation, the village priest sends for a plague doctor from the city. The doctor arrives in a distinctive beaked mask and long dark robes, a sinister bird-like figure, more omen than savior. The mask is stuffed with straw, herbs and spices believed to purify the noxious humors of disease. But to the apprentice, it seems as though death itself has come, a grim reaper making his rounds. The doctor sets to work, his methods based more on superstition than science. He lights bonfires to clear the putrid air, prescribes potions of mercury, arsenic and ground unicorn horn, cuts open the buboes to release the deadly vapors, and then cauterizes them with a red-hot poker. His patients scream in agony, their cries almost as dreadful as the sickness itself. More often than not, he merely eases their passing with opium and prayer. The apprentice sees no sign of the disease loosening its grip. The death toll mounts day by day, the bodies piling up faster than they can be buried. Carts rumble through the streets, their drivers calling out, "Bring out your dead." Bereaved families tip their loved ones into mass graves, unable to provide proper funerals or mourning. Some choose to wall up the sick in their homes, leaving them to die alone rather than risk infection. Others abandon them on the roadside or worse, blame them for bringing the sickness and attack them as witches. As the death toll mounts, society itself begins to break down. With so many taken ill or fleeing, there are not enough well folks to tend the fields, keep the forges lit, weave the cloth, guard the towns. Crops wither on the vine, livestock roam unattended. The manor lord withdraws to his keep, posting archers to shoot any sick peasants who approach, seeking aid. Roaming gangs of bandits prey on travelers and unprotected villages. Some turn to wild revelry, drinking and feasting, reasoning they may die tomorrow. Others fall into despair and madness, donning sackcloth, whipping themselves in penance, becoming flagellants, wandering the land. Through it all, the apprentice somehow survives, tending to his stricken household, his tools sitting idle. But as the Black Death burns itself out over months, leaving half the village dead, he wonders what is left to live for. His master, his friends, his purpose, all taken by the merciless pestilence. He is alone and adrift, the future he once dreamed of turned to ashes and dust, and yet, as a numb torpor settles over him, a strange thought kindles in the depths of his grief. He is alive, against all odds he endures. The sickness did not take him. His strong young body, tempered by long hours at the forge, has proven its mettle. As the shock subsides, a flicker of determination stirs within him. He stands alone, the last one standing. Now it falls to him to rebuild, to pick up the pieces. Slowly, with trembling hands, the apprentice pulls his apron over his head and picks up his hammer. The cool metal in his hands, the familiar weight grounding him, fills him with a sense of purpose. He pumps the bellows, watching the coals spring to life, a tiny sun illuminating the darkness. He is no longer under the tutelage of a master. He must forge his own path. No customers, no coin. He must create something from nothing. No roadmap, no plan. He must chart his own course. But as he draws the glowing iron from the forge and sets it on the anvil, a glimmer of hope ignites within him. The world has crumbled to dust around him. Yet, from the ashes, the smithy knows new things can be forged. Just as the plague ravaged the land, purging the old order, perhaps it has also cleared the way for something new. A blank slate, a chance to rebuild from the rubble. With each strike of his hammer, the apprentice pours his grief, his rage, and his defiant will to live into the metal. He doesn't know what shape it will take, a tool, a weapon, a talisman. But he knows it will carry a piece of his resilient spirit within it, hard and shining. An emblem of the human ability to persist, to create meaning and beauty even in the deepest darkness. The plume of the plague has passed, leaving a shattered world in its wake. But in a humble forge, a spark endures, kindling an ember of determination. The apprentice knows not what the future holds. Yet he knows he will meet it, as the blacksmith meets the iron with sweat, skill, and indomitable will, forging ahead into the unknown. The 100 Years' War raged across medieval Europe like a wildfire, consuming lives, resources, and hope with equal fervor. What began as a squabble over succession to the French throne metastasized into a generations-long struggle as the kings of England and France vied for supremacy. But as usual, the common people bore the heaviest burden. Displaced from their homes, conscripted into battle, caught in the relentless pursuit of rival noble ambitions. Our young blacksmith, still recovering from the devastation wrought by the Black Death, finds himself swept up in this colossal conflict. With the ranks of fighting men decimated by disease, the local lord compels every able-bodied man into service to bolster his army. The smith, with his robust physique and familiarity with weapons, becomes an obvious target. He is forcibly removed from his forge and handed a dented second-hand sword, a cheap metal helmet, and a rusted mail, providing scant protection against the arrows, blades, and bludgeons of war. The apprentice-turned-soldier marches off to fight a battle he barely comprehends for a cause that holds no significance for him. He leaves behind his village, his forge, and the fading aspirations of the life he had envisioned. He is now a mere pawn on the Lord's chessboard, a cog in the feudal machinery of warfare. His wishes and well-being are utterly disregarded. The sheer number of lives to be sacrificed in the fray is staggering. He huddles around meager campfires with the other conscripts, a motley crew of farmers, laborers, tradesmen, and beggars. They are all equally grimy, hungry, and fearful, united only by their lowly station and the whims of their superiors. They exchange rumors of the English army's numbers, their formidable longbowmen, and the newfangled cannons that spew iron and fire. Some boast of the glory and plunder that await them, but most simply pray for survival, for the chance to return home and reunite with their families. However, the harsh reality of battle shatters even these modest hopes. The young smith finds himself in a muddy field in Craa, a small village that would later become a significant historical landmark. It is an unbearably hot day. The men's shirts are searing their skin, and the horses are drenched in sweat. The English have taken the high ground, but the French knights, driven by pride and impulsiveness, insist on charging. The first rank thunders forward, a formidable wall of steel and horseflesh, only to be swiftly reduced to a wheat field of arrows from the English longbows. The knights crash into their own footmen, trampling them in their desperate attempt to retreat. The second wave meets the same grim fate, with fallen mounts and men becoming obstacles for the next. It's a catastrophic disaster, the fabled flower of French chivalry wilting in an afternoon. For the blacksmith and his fellow craftsmen, it's a vision of hell. Horses scream and thrash in the mud, riddled with arrows, their gleaming armor gaping open to reveal the bloody ruin beneath. Limbs and heads scatter like threshing chaff, and the ground churns into a slurry of entrails and earth. The awful, unrelenting hiss and hum of the arrows resemble monstrous insects, while the smells of blood, loose bowels, smoke, and metal fill the air on a broiling hot day. The hideous sound of iron and bone colliding repeatedly fills the air. The apprentice fights not for king and country, but for his own survival. All thoughts of glory or bravery vanish, leaving only the primal instinct to live. He swings his sword wildly, clumsily, and desperately tries to keep the Englishmen at arms from gutting him. His arms ache, his breath comes in ragged gasps, and his eyes sting with sweat and smoke. He slips in the mud and is swept under a stampede of retreating footmen, fearing he'll be crushed. By the time he regains his feet, the day is definitively lost. The French are in full retreat. His only solace is that he is fleeing too, bloodied and battered, yet somehow still breathing. As the young smith stumbles away from that charred field, he wonders if survival is truly a mercy. He sees things he will never unsee, things that will haunt him in nightmares, waking and sleeping for years to come. The twisted faces of the dead, the inhuman sounds of the dying, and the terrible casual cruelty of war, snuffing out lives like candles, reside in his mind. He has forged fine steel blades, but never before has he felt their true purpose, to rend, pierce, and slaughter. In the crucible of combat, he witnessed the abyss of human brutality, forever altering his being. The arduous journey back to his village was fraught with hardship. Of his original band of conscripts, scarcely 1 in 3 survived. They limped home like skeletal scarecrows, their hollow eyes and gaunt frames a testament to their suffering. Some bore grievous wounds that would surely lead to decay. Victory eluded them, and glory remained a distant dream. Instead, they were haunted by the horrors they had witnessed and inflicted. The lords in their lofty castles engaged in toasts and strategic maneuvers, their pieces poised for the next encounter. But for the foot soldiers, archers, blacksmiths, and warriors, the ground was their battleground. War left only scars and echoes, haunting their sleep and tormenting their days. The young smith found his forge cold and his tools rusted. The hopeful future he once envisioned now seemed like a cruel jest. His fields lay barren, having been sown while he fought for his lord's cause. His meager savings had dwindled to nothing. He would have to rebuild from the ashes of his past. This time his hands trembled when he gripped the hammer, and his ears rang with the phantom twang of bowstrings. A heart that had been cauterized by suffering he never sought. Determined, he picked up his tools, for he had no other choice. But he was a changed man now, older and hardened by the fires of pestilence and war. The relentless 100-year war would continue to consume lives and hopes, leaving kings and kingdoms in its wake. In medieval Europe, the manor system served as the backbone of feudal society. At the heart of each manor stood the Lord's Keep, a fortified stone building that served as both a residence and a symbol of power. Surrounding the keep were the humble dwellings of the serfs, small one-room huts constructed from mud and thatch. These huts were clustered together in a village where a communal well and perhaps a modest church provided basic amenities. The serfs were bound to the land through a complex web of obligations and duties to their lord. In exchange for a small plot of land to cultivate for themselves, the serfs were compelled to labor in the lord's fields, paying rent in the form of crops and their labor. Their freedom and autonomy were severely restricted. The lord dictated their living quarters, marriage partners, and even the crops they could cultivate. This rigid social hierarchy determined each person's role and status based solely on birth. At the pinnacle of this hierarchy stood the nobility, possessing vast land holdings, opulent attire, and grand feasts. Below them were the clergy, who wielded significant power and influence through the church. At the very bottom were the serfs, the poorest and most oppressed class, who toiled tirelessly in the fields from dawn till dusk. The lord and lady of this particular manor were a vain and petty pair, fixated on maintaining their status and prestige. They constantly sought to outshine neighboring noble families in displays of wealth and power. Sir Reginald, the lord, was a cruel and calloused man, quick to anger and slow to forgive. He would mercilessly punish a serf for even the slightest infraction, such as a stray pig in his gardens or a perceived slight to his authority. The punishments were harsh and humiliating, often involving public floggings or time in the stocks. Lady Eloise, his wife, was no less heartless. She spent her days indulging in idle gossip and needlepoint, incessantly complaining about the quality of the food or the laziness of the servants. She demanded the finest silks and furs, disregarding the exorbitant expense and the toll it took on the serfs, whose labor funded her luxurious lifestyle. Together, Lord Reginald and Lady Eloise ruled their little thief with an iron fist, extracting every last drop of labor and loyalty from their beleaguered subjects. Life on the manor was an unending cycle of work, punctuated only by the occasional feast day or wedding. The serfs were essentially property, devoid of rights and with no recourse against the whims and cruelties of their lord and lady. They were born into this life of servitude, and most would die, never experiencing anything beyond it. One such serf was a young man named John. Raised on the manor, John witnessed his father and grandfather bowing and scraping before the Lord, breaking their backs in the fields to barely make ends meet. As a boy, John yearned for a different life, dreaming of becoming a warrior or a merchant, and exploring the world beyond the village's confines. However, as he grew older, he realized the futility of such dreams. Bound by birth and debt, John had no hope of escape. John's life took a turn for the worse when Lord Reginald decided to host a lavish feast for the neighboring nobles. Seeking to impress them with his wealth and generosity, Lord Reginald aimed to establish himself as a formidable force. But such a feast was expensive, and Lord Reginald, unwilling to deplete his own coffers, increased the rents and taxes on his serfs. He demanded more of their crops and labor. John's family was already struggling to make ends meet, and the increased burden proved too much to bear. They faced a difficult choice: pay their rent or have enough to eat. Tragically, John's father fell ill from the stress and overwork, and without access to proper medicine, he succumbed to his illness. Left as the head of the household, John was desperate and angry. In a reckless act of defiance, he sneaked into Lord Reginald's storehouse and stole a sack of grain. It was a small act of rebellion, a way to feed his family for a short while longer, but it was also a grave crime. When the theft was discovered, Lord Reginald was furious. John was dragged before the Lord and forced to confess his crime. In front of the entire village, he was stripped to the waist and tied to a post. Lord Reginald himself wielded the whip, unleashing a fury born of wounded pride upon John's back. The punishment was brutal, far exceeding the severity of the crime. By the end, John's back was a raw, bleeding mess, and he could barely stand. John was thrown into a dank cell to recover, with only mouldy straw for a bed and stale bread and water to sustain him. As he lay there, half delirious with pain and fever, he cursed the unfairness of it all. He had only stolen to feed his starving family, and for that he had been beaten nearly to death. Meanwhile, Lord Reginald dined on roast pheasant and fine wine, never sparing a thought for the serfs who made his lavish lifestyle possible. It was a brutal and unjust system, and John felt the full weight of its oppression bearing down on him. But what could he do? He was just one man, a lowly serf with no power or influence. He knew that any further acts of rebellion would only bring more pain and suffering down on himself and his loved ones. And so, with a heavy heart, John resigned himself to his fate. He would continue to toil in the fields, to bow and scrape before his lord and lady, to endure the hardships and humiliations of life as a serf. As he drifted off into an uneasy sleep, John's last thoughts were of his father, who had worked himself into an early grave, and of his own children, who would likely face the same bleak future. It was a cycle of poverty and oppression that seemed unbreakable, a yoke that would burden generations to come. In that moment, the grandeur and chivalry of the feudal system seemed like a cruel joke, a thin veneer over a rotten and stagnant core. And John wept for himself and for all the other nameless, faceless serfs who suffered under its weight. But even in the depths of his despair, John clung to a faint hope. He had heard whispers of change on the wind, of peasant revolts in far-off lands, and of the rise of a new class of artisans and merchants in the towns. Perhaps in time, the old order would crumble, and a new, more just society would take its place. It was a fragile dream, but it was all he had to cling to in the dark. As the years passed, John's scars healed, but the memory of his brutal punishment never faded. It served as a constant reminder of his place in the world, the vast chasm between the privileged and the impoverished. He married and had children of his own, watching with a heavy heart as they took their place in the fields beside him. There were moments of joy, of course, the birth of a healthy child, a bountiful harvest, the rare feast day when work ceased and ale flowed freely. But these were fleeting respites in a life of relentless toil and hardship, the spectre of hunger, disease, and divine wrath always looming, ready to snatch away their meager comforts. As John aged, he felt the toll of a lifetime of labor in his bones. His hands were gnarled and calloused, his back stooped from years of bending over the plow. He watched as his own children grew up and took their place in the cycle of poverty and servitude, and he felt a deep aching sadness. But he also felt a flicker of something else, a small, stubborn flame of resilience and hope. Despite the hardships and injustices they faced, the Manor's serfs were a community bound together by shared suffering and small acts of kindness. They looked out for one another, sharing what little they had in times of need, celebrating together when they could. And in that solidarity, John found a kind of strength. It wasn't the strength of kings and knights, but the quiet, enduring strength of the common man, the strength to rise each morning and face another day of back-breaking labor, to find moments of laughter and love amidst the struggle, to dream of a better life, even when all seemed hopeless. As he lay on his deathbed, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, John reflected on his life. It had been a hard one, filled with pain and injustice. But it had also been a life lived with integrity, a stubborn refusal to let the world's cruelties break his spirit. In the end, that was perhaps his greatest legacy. Not wealth or status, but the unwavering dignity of a life well lived amidst adversity. As John drew his final breath, he allowed himself to envision a future where his descendants might experience a different kind of life, one free from servitude, where a person's worth wasn't dictated by their birth circumstances. It was a distant dream, yet one worth clinging to, even in the darkest of times. With that final, quiet hope, John slipped away, leaving behind a world that would continue its eternal cycle of seasons, of sowing and reaping, of birth and death and rebirth. The manor and its inhabitants would endure as they always had, finding fleeting moments of grace and beauty amidst their struggles, waiting for the day when the old order might finally give way to the new. The life of a peasant farmer in medieval Europe was one of relentless toil and hardship. From dawn till dusk, they labored in the fields, their hands calloused and blistered from handling primitive tools. The plough, a simple wooden contraption, was pulled by an ox or horse, if the farmer was fortunate enough to have one. More often, the farmer and his family would drag the plough through the stubborn earth themselves, their muscles straining with each step. The crops they cultivated were meager and basic: wheat, barley, rye, and perhaps some vegetables if there was spare land. The yield was uncertain, always at the mercy of the weather and pests. A failed harvest meant going hungry and unable to pay the rent and taxes owed to the lord of the manor. It was a precarious existence, always teetering on the brink of ruin. Even in good years, the life of a peasant was one of subsistence. Most of what they grew went to the lord as payment for living and working on his land. They were left with just enough to feed themselves. And even then, the food was plain and monotonous. Bread made from coarse grains, pottages of vegetables and beans, and the occasional scrap of meat or cheese if they were fortunate. The peasants endured relentless and back-breaking labor, ploughing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting with only crude hand tools. There were no days off or rest breaks from the constant toil. Even children as young as 5 or 6 were put to work, scaring away birds or gleaning the fields for fallen grain. Elderly family members who could no longer handle the physical labor would spin wool or engage in other handicrafts to contribute. The living conditions were squalid and cramped. Peasant families resided in small one-room huts made of wattle and daub. The roofs were thatched with straw, and the floors were covered with dirt, rushes or straw that would grow faded and infested over time. There was no privacy, and the smells and noise of the livestock that often shared their living space were constant. Disease was a constant threat, exacerbated by the lack of hygiene and sanitation. Dysentery, typhoid, and other illnesses spread easily in the close quarters and contaminated water. Injuries from farm work were common, and there was little effective medical treatment beyond herbal remedies and prayer. A simple cut could become infected and fatal, while a broken bone could leave a person crippled for life. Despite all these hardships, the peasants clung to their faith and their families for solace. The church offered the promise of a better life after death, a reward for their suffering and toil in this world. Marriages and births were causes for celebration. Brief rest breaks from the daily drudgery, however, even these joys were tempered by the harsh realities of the time. Many children didn't survive to adulthood, succumbing to disease or malnutrition. Women often died in childbirth, leaving their husbands to remarry quickly out of necessity. The elderly, too frail to work, were seen as burdens, another mouth to feed in a world of scarcity. Despite it all, the peasants endured. Year after year, they found fleeting moments of joy amidst the hardships. A bountiful harvest, a juicy piece of gossip, or a lively tune played on a homemade instrument brought them a sense of relief and camaraderie. They shared stories and sang songs to pass the time and lighten their burdens, even if only for a brief respite. However, the ever-present spectre of the Lord loomed over them. His manor house perched on the hill served as a constant reminder of their subjugation within the rigid social order. Bound to him and the land, they had little hope of ever altering their station. The Lord wielded absolute control over every aspect of their lives, from the crops they cultivated to the marriages they entered into. The peasants were essentially the Lord's property, unable to leave the manor without his explicit permission. This system of slavery, passed down from father to son and mother to daughter, was a harsh reality. The Lord had the power to punish them for any perceived infraction, ranging from failing to pay taxes to poaching game in his forest. The consequences were severe, including fines, floggings, and imprisonment in stocks. Despite the dire circumstances under their lord, the peasants were even more apprehensive about the chaos that awaited them in the outside world. Tales of marauding bandits and entire villages decimated by disease or famine circulated among them. At least on the Manora, there was a semblance of stability and security, albeit at the expense of their freedom. Thus they endured these resilient men and women struggling to survive on the fringes of society. They witnessed the wars and intrigues of the nobles, but were rarely directly affected by their machinations. Their immediate concerns revolved around the weather, the harvest, and the health of their livestock. Even the most humble peasant harbored a glimmer of hope for a better life, though they understood that it was likely beyond their reach. Perhaps their children or grandchildren would be the ones to break free from the yoke of serfdom and carve out a name for themselves as skilled artisans or prosperous merchants. It was a faint hope, but it was often all they had to cling to in a world indifferent to their suffering. Day after day, season after season, they toiled, their lives a testament to the indomitable human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. While the life of a peasant farmer was undoubtedly difficult, others in medieval society endured even greater hardships and indignities. The life of a serf, the lowest rung on the feudal ladder, was one of relentless servitude and oppression. Bound to the land, serfs were unable to leave the manor without their lord's permission. They were required to work a specific number of days each week on the lord's fields, often alongside their own small plots. This labor was unpaid, a form of rent for the right to live and farm on the lord's estate. However, the obligations of a serf extended far beyond mere labor. They were subject to a dizzying array of taxes and fees levied on everything from the grain they harvested to the animals they slaughtered. If a serf died without an heir, their possessions would revert back to the lord. And if a serf committed a crime, they faced punishments as severe as execution. The life of a serf was a constant state of fear and powerlessness. They had no rights, no recourse against the whims and cruelties of their lord. Serfs could be bought and sold like livestock, and their families could be torn apart at the lord's discretion. Even their personal lives were subject to the lord's control. A serf could not marry without permission, and the lord could decide who they would marry. Any children born to a serf couple automatically became serfs themselves, destined to a life of servitude. It was a bleak existence, offering little hope of escape or betterment. Some serfs attempted to run away, seeking a better life in the towns or cities. However, if caught, the punishments were severe. A returned serf could expect a brutal flogging at the very least. Repeat offenders might have their feet cut off or be hanged as an example to others. Despite the risks, the desire for freedom remained a powerful one. Serfs, the laborers of the medieval landscape, had long endured the tyrannical rule of their lords. These cruel and capricious men, known for their harsh punishments and insatiable greed, constantly raised taxes, leaving serfs with barely enough to feed their families. They took the best of their crops and livestock for themselves, leaving them with the dregs. One day, after a particularly bad harvest, the lord demanded even more from his serfs, ordering them to work his fields from dawn to dusk with no rest or food. It was the final straw for the long-suffering villagers. Led by a young man named John, a group of serfs decided to take a stand. They refused to go to the fields and instead gathered in the village square, calling for an end to their mistreatment. Word of their defiance spread quickly, and soon serfs from neighboring manors had joined them, their ranks swelling to over 100 strong. The lord, enraged by this unprecedented show of rebellion, called for his knights to quell the uprising. The armored men rode into the village, their swords and lances at the ready. But the serfs, armed with only their farm tools and their determination, refused to back down. A fierce battle ensued, with serfs fighting with a desperate courage born of years of oppression. Some fell to the knights' blades, their blood staining the muddy ground, but others managed to unhorse their attackers, turning the tide of the fight. In the end, the serfs emerged victorious, and the lord and his men retreated in disarray. It was a stunning triumph, a moment of hope and possibility in a world that offered little of either. But the victory was short-lived. Word of the uprising spread rapidly, and soon other lords dispatched their own knights to restore order. The rebels were captured and brought before a hastily convened court, where they were sentenced to death for their treason. John, the young leader of the rebellion, was singled out for special punishment. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body parts displayed as a warning to any other would-be rebels. The other surfers met similarly grim fates, their brief moment of freedom extinguished in a blaze of aristocratic vengeance. The village was left shattered and subdued, a stark testament to the ruthless power of the feudal system. However, the story of John and his fellow rebels endured, whispered around hearths and passed down through generations. It became a symbol of the yearning for freedom that resided in the hearts of even the most humble surfers, a flicker of light in the darkness of medieval oppression. The feudal system that bound surfers to the land and their lords was a complex web of obligations and customs that had evolved over centuries. At its core was the manor, a self-sufficient agricultural estate that formed the backbone of the medieval economy. The manor was ruled by a lord who held the land by grant from the king in exchange for military service. The lord resided in the manor house, a fortified stone structure that dominated the landscape and served as a symbol of his power and authority. Surrounding the manor house were the fields, pastures, and woodlands that sustained the estate. These were worked by the surfers, who were bound to the land and obligated to provide labor and a share of their crops to the lord. The surfers lived in small cottages clustered around the manor house, their lives governed by the rhythms of the agricultural year. They were divided into several classes, each with its own set of obligations and privileges. At the bottom were the villeins, essentially slaves bound to the land and the lord for life. They had no rights and could be bought and sold like property. Above them stood the boarders and cotters, who enjoyed slightly more freedom but were still bound to the manor and subject to the lord's will. Higher still were the freemen, who held their land through rent rather than labor and possessed more legal rights. However, even they were not entirely free. They still owed allegiance and service to their lord. The manor functioned as a self-contained world, complete with its own church, mill, blacksmith, and other tradesmen. The lord presided over this realm, dispensing justice in the manor court and collecting rents and taxes from his tenants. This system had endured for centuries, providing a semblance of stability and security in a world fraught with chaos and violence. Yet it also fostered inequality and exploitation, with the vast majority of the population living in perpetual servitude. For the serfs, life on the manor was a constant struggle for survival. They were at the mercy of the weather, the harvest, and the whims of their lord. A poor year could lead to starvation and ruin, while a favorable one might offer a brief respite from the grinding poverty. Their daily lives were governed by intricate rules and customs that varied from manor to manor. In some places, serfs were compelled to grind their grain at the lord's mill and bake their bread in his ovens, incurring a fee for the privilege. In others, they were prohibited from cutting wood in the lord's forests or fishing in his streams. Non-compliance with these regulations could result in severe punishments, ranging from fines to floggings and imprisonment in the manor's dungeon. The lord wielded the power of life and death over his serfs with often ruthless efficiency. Despite the hardships, there were moments of joy and community on the manor. The church served as a hub of social life, hosting masses, saints' days, and other festivals that provided a respite from the daily grind. Weddings and christenings were occasions for feasting and celebration, even if the festivities were modest by modern standards. But the spectre of the Lord loomed over the proceedings, a constant reminder of the rigid social hierarchy that governed every aspect of manor life. The Lord and his family resided in a world far removed from the serfs, adorned in fine clothes, indulging in rich foods, and engaging in leisurely pursuits. Even a fleeting glimpse of this world served as a stark reminder of their place in the order of things. Serfs might catch sight of the Lord's hunting party riding out with their hounds and falcons, or hear the sounds of a feast emanating from the manor house. However, they understood that such pleasures were beyond their reach. The story of one such feast has endured through the centuries, a tale of opulence and excess that stands in stark contrast to the lives of the serfs who made it possible. It was the wedding feast of the Lord's eldest son, a lavish affair that spanned 3 days and nights. No expense was spared in the preparations, with the finest foods and wines procured from across the land. The manor's kitchen buzzed with activity as cooks and sculls worked tirelessly to prepare the feast. Whole oxen and pigs were roasted on spits, while smaller game birds were baked into pies and pastries. Fish from the estate's ponds were fried and served with rich sauces, while wheels of cheese and loaves of bread were piled high on platters. For the serfs, the feast was a source of both wonder and resentment. They marveled at the abundance of food and drink so far removed from their own meager rations. Yet they also seethed at the injustice of it all, knowing that their own hard work had made such extravagance possible. As the feast continued, the sounds of music and laughter drifted out from the manor house, mingling with the clatter of plates and the clinking of goblets. The lords and ladies danced and revelled, their finery shimmering in the candlelight. Meanwhile, the serfs huddled in their cottages, their bellies empty and their hearts heavy. Some murmured darkly about the unfairness of it all, while others simply sighed and went about their work, resigned to the fact that nothing could be done. In the end, the wedding feast stood as a stark symbol of the vast gulf that separated the lords from the serfs, a constant reminder of the rigid social hierarchy that governed every aspect of medieval life. It was a world of stark contrasts, where the privilege and abundance of the few were built on the backs of the many. Yet even in the face of such inequality, the serfs found ways to resist and assert their humanity. They shared stories and sang songs that mocked the pretensions of their lords, finding humor and solace in their shared hardships. They formed tight-knit communities, looking out for one another, knowing that in a world so hostile to their existence, they had only each other to rely on. And in rare moments of defiance, they pushed back against the oppressive system that held them captive. Whispers of secret meetings in the woods circulated, where serfs gathered to plot rebellion and dream of a better life. Some even dared to flee the manor, risking everything for a chance at freedom. While most of these acts of resistance were small and fleeting, quickly crushed by the weight of feudal power, they served as a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit. Even in the darkest of times, the human spirit could not be completely extinguished. For the serf, life on the manor was a constant struggle, a battle against the elements, the Lord, and the very system that held them in bondage. But it was also a testament to the enduring spirit of the human spirit, to the ability to find moments of joy and solidarity even in the bleakest of circumstances. As we reflect on the feudal world of the Middle Ages, it is easy to focus solely on the oppression and suffering. However, we must also remember the quiet acts of resistance and the enduring spirit of those who lived and died under its yoke. Their stories may be lost to time, but their legacy endures in the very fabric of our modern world. A world built on the struggles and sacrifices of countless generations who came before. In remembering them, we honor the unsung heroes of history, the serfs and peasants who bore the weight of feudalism on their backs and in their hearts. The Middle Ages were a time of great upheaval and change. As the old world of feudalism began to give way to the rise of towns and trade, the serfs on the manor faced both new opportunities and challenges. As trade routes expanded and cities grew, there was an increased demand for the goods and products of the countryside. Some lords saw the value in allowing their serfs more freedom to produce and sell their wares, realizing that it could increase their own wealth and power. However, the growth of the town brought its own struggles. The once prosperous town was now a mere shadow of its former self, with empty streets and bare market stalls. The plague had taken a heavy toll, not just in lives lost, but in the very fabric of society. With so many gone, there were fewer customers to buy his wares, fewer apprentices to train, and fewer hands to help with the work. He would often sit by the forge late into the night, staring into the flickering flames, lost in memories of happier times. The laughter of his children, the gentle touch of his wife's hand, the bustling energy of the town square on market day. Now all was silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the echoing ring of his hammer. But still he persevered. He took on what work he could, repairing farm tools and chewing the occasional horse. He traded his skills for food and supplies, bartering with what few neighbors remained. And slowly, painfully, life went on. Yet even as the town began to recover, new challenges emerged. The ongoing war between England and France had reached a fever pitch, and the demand for weapons and armor was high. The blacksmith, conscripted by his lord, labored tirelessly in the castle forge, churning out swords and shields for the army. The sweltering heat, blistering hands, and aching back were relentless. Despite the poor quality of the metal and the scarcity of charcoal, he had no choice but to obey, fearing punishment or exile. As he worked, he couldn't help but think of the young men who would wield these weapons, marching off to a war they barely comprehended. Most of them were peasant boys, just like his own son. Ill-equipped and untrained, they would be mere fodder for the enemy's arrows and blades. The blacksmith had witnessed this before during the previous campaign. His son, barely old enough to grow a beard, had been called up to fight for the Lord's cause. He had marched off with a rusty sword and a patched gambeson, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. For weeks the blacksmith had anxiously awaited news, his heart heavy with dread. Then, one rainy morning, a bedraggled messenger arrived at the forge with a small bundle of blood-stained rags. It was his son's meager possessions, all that remained of his short life. Overwhelmed with grief, the blacksmith wept, his sobs shaking his entire body. He cursed the lords and their petty squabbles, the war and the waste of it all. But most of all, he cursed himself for not being able to protect his own flesh and blood. As he hammered out another blade, he couldn't help but wonder how many more fathers would experience the same anguish. How many more sons would be lost to the merciless grind of war? It seemed like an endless cycle, a cruel joke played by the fates. But what could a lowly blacksmith do? Bound by the feudal system, he was a mere serf tied to the land and the whims of his lord. He had no say in the decisions of kings and nobles, no power to alter the course of history. All he could do was keep his head down, his hands busy, and pray that someday things would be different. As the sun began to set outside the castle walls, the blacksmith wiped the sweat and soot from his brow. He gathered the finished swords, each a masterpiece of craftsmanship despite the inferior materials. He would present them to the armorer in the morning, another job well done. But as he trudged back to his empty cottage, his thoughts were heavy with grief and resignation. This was his fate in life, to toil and suffer like countless generations before him. To watch his loved ones succumb to disease, starvation, and violence, to endure the back-breaking labor and the oppressive rule of the manor. And yet even in the darkest moments, there was still a flicker of hope, a stubborn resilience that refused to be extinguished, a determination to carry on despite the odds. It was the same spirit that had driven his ancestors to clear the forests, to plant the fields, to build the villages that dotted the landscape. It was the spirit of the peasant, the serf, the common man, the one who kept the gears of society turning even as the lords and ladies danced and feasted above, the one who found joy in the simple things, a hearty meal, a warm fire, the love of family and friends. As the blacksmith lay down on his straw mattress, his body aching with fatigue, he clung to that spirit like a lifeline. He whispered a prayer for his son, for his wife, for all the souls lost to the unforgiving maw of history. And he vowed to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep living no matter what trials lay ahead. For that was the only choice he had. In a world of chaos and uncertainty, of disease and death, and endless drudgery, the only constant was the indomitable will of the human spirit. And as long as that flame burned bright, there was still hope for a better tomorrow. The blacksmith closed his eyes and let the exhaustion overtake him. As he drifted off to sleep, he dreamed of a world where his children could grow up safe and healthy, where the land was bountiful and the people were free. In a world where the clang of swords was replaced by the ringing of church bells, laughter and song echoed through the streets. It was a beautiful dream, a fleeting glimpse of what could be. Though the blacksmith knew it was just a dream, he clung to it with all his might. For in that moment, in the quiet stillness of the night, anything seemed possible, and so he slept, his breath slow and steady, his heart filled with a fragile and desperate hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new sorrows, and new burdens to bear. But for now, in the embrace of slumber, he could find a moment's peace. Such was the lot of the medieval peasant, the forgotten hero of history, the one who endured, persevered, and kept the flame of humanity burning through the darkest of times. Their stories may be lost to the ages, their names consigned to the footnotes of dusty tomes, but their legacy lives on in the very soil beneath our feet, in the blood that courses through our veins. We are the sons and daughters of surfers, the heirs to 1,000 generations of struggle and sacrifice. Though our lives may be easier, our burdens lighter, we must never forget the debt we owe to those who came before, the ones who built the foundations of our world brick by backbreaking brick. So, let us remember them, these unsung heroes of the Middle Ages. Let us honor their memory not with grand monuments or gilded tombs, but with the simple act of living, cherishing the gifts they gave us, and striving to build a better world for those who will come after. For in the end, that is the only monument that matters. The one that lives on in the hearts and minds of those who follow, echoing through the ages like a clarion call. A reminder that even in the darkest of times there is still light, and that even in the face of unimaginable hardship, the human spirit endures. And so, as we drift off to sleep in our soft beds and climate-controlled rooms, let us spare a thought for the blacksmith and his kin, for the countless nameless, faceless peasants who toiled, suffered, and died so that we might live. Let us remember them. In doing so, we remember ourselves, for we are all part of the grand tapestry of history, woven together by the threads of time and circumstance. Though our individual contributions may seem small and insignificant, they collectively form a breathtaking pattern of beauty and complexity. This pattern stretches back to the dawn of civilization and extends to the very edge of tomorrow. So, dear listener, sleep well. Sleep and dream of a world where the plight of the peasants is but a distant memory. A world where all people, regardless of their birth or station, can live with dignity and hope. It may seem an impossible dream, a fool's errand in a world still rife with inequality and injustice. But as the blacksmith wisely knew, even the most improbable dreams can come true if we only have the courage to believe, fight, strive, and persevere against all odds. That is the lesson of the Middle Ages, the lesson of human history itself, and it is a lesson we would do well to remember. So, sleep well, my friend, sleep well and dream big, for in the end, we all share the same dreams, for life, for love, and for a better tomorrow. And though the road ahead may be long and arduous, we walk it together, hand in hand, heart to heart, step by step into the bright promise of the future. A future built on the strength and sacrifice of those who came before, those countless souls who struggled and strived to make the dream of a better world a reality. And in those dark and challenging times, they had faith, faith in themselves, faith in each other, faith in the indomitable power of the human spirit to overcome any obstacle. It is a faith that has sustained us through the centuries, a faith that burns as brightly now as it did all those years ago. So, let us keep that faith alive even as we honor those who came before us. Let us honor their memory by leading purposeful and meaningful lives, striving to make the world a better place than we inherited it. It is the least we can do, the only fitting tribute to the forgotten heroes of history. As we drift off to sleep, safe and warm, let us offer a silent prayer of gratitude. Thank you for the blessings we enjoy, for the sacrifices made in the past, and for the hope of a brighter tomorrow. For we are the dreams of our ancestors, the culmination of their struggles and triumphs. Though they may be lost to history, they live on within us, woven into the very fabric of our being. So, sleep well, dear listener. Sleep and dream, and remember that, in the end, that is all any of us can do. Remember, dream, and carry on the eternal fight for a better world. A world where the plight of the peasants is a distant memory, and the light of hope shines brightly for all to see. The cycles of poverty, disease, and oppression continued year after year for the common folk of medieval Europe. Despite their constant toil and hardship, there were moments of joy and celebration that punctuated their difficult lives. A wedding was always a joyous occasion in the village. The bride and groom, though young and facing an uncertain future, beamed with hopeful smiles as they stood before the priest. Their families had scrimped and saved to afford a modest feast consisting of a bit of pork, some precious white bread, and even a flagon of weak wine. The fiddler played a lively tune, and the villagers danced and laughed, momentarily forgetting their troubles for a few merry hours. The birth of a child was another cause for celebration. Though tempered by the harsh realities of life, many infants would not survive their first year, succumbing to disease, malnutrition, or the elements. But for now, the new parents marveled at their tiny creation, counting fingers and toes, and praying for a strong, healthy baby. Grandmothers and aunts clucked and fussed, imparting their wisdom on swaddling and nursing. A new life, so fragile and precious, ignited a spark of hope within the family. The changing seasons also signified the passage of time and brought occasional festivities. Harvest time, if the yields were bountiful, was a period of relief and genuine joy. The grueling work of reaping the fields from dawn till dusk was rewarded with overflowing bushels of grain. The lord of the manor would claim his share, but there was still enough to fill hungry bellies and store away for the lean winter months ahead. The villagers gathered for a harvest feast, sharing the fruits of their labor in a spirit of camaraderie. Platters of roasted meats, hearty vegetable pottages, and freshly baked bread awaited them at the rustic wooden tables. Ale flowed freely, courtesy of the master vintner, who had been given extra rations to produce a special batch for the occasion. Music and boisterous laughter echoed into the night as the people reveled, shedding the shackles of their oppression for a single joyous evening. Holidays, both religious and secular, provided another welcome respite from the drudgery of daily life. Christmas brought feasting and caroling, while Easter heralded the arrival of spring. May Day celebrated the return of warmer weather with dancing around the maypole. Although the aristocracy marked these occasions with lavish banquets and pageantry, the common folk had their own humble traditions. At Christmas, serf families would gather in their modest one-room houses, huddled close around the hearth for warmth. The crackling of the old log cast a gentle glow on their faces as they exchanged small handmade gifts: a child's doll crafted from corn husks, a new woolen cloak stitched by mother. They sang the old carols and shared stories of Christmases past, finding solace in the familiar rituals. On May Day morning, the young maidens of the village would slip out at dawn to bathe in the dew, believing it would bring them health and beauty for the coming year. They would gather wildflowers to weave into garlands for their hair and dance around the maypole, their brightly colored ribbons fluttering in the breeze. The young men would cast admiring glances at the pretty girls, and new courtships began to blossom along with the spring buds. However, these joyful celebrations were but brief interludes in lives filled with constant struggle. For most peasants, each day was much like the last. They would rise with the sun to tend the fields, toiling under the watchful eye of the manor lord's reeve, and fall into bed, bone-tired as the last light faded from the sky. It was a hard, precarious existence with little hope of change or betterment. Despite this, there were stirrings of discontent. small sparks of rebellion kindling among the downtrodden. In 1358, French peasants revolted against the heavy taxes and oppressive conditions in the Jacquerie Uprising, burning noble estates and demanding reforms. Although the revolt was harshly suppressed, it planted the seeds of resistance. In England, in 1381, the peasants' revolt saw tens of thousands of commoners, led by the rabble-rousing Wat Tyler, march on London to protest the heavy tax burden and lack of rights. They stormed the Tower of London, ransacked the Archbishop's quarters, and presented their demands to the 14-year-old King Richard II. Tyler was killed in a scuffle with the Lord Mayor, and the young king deftly dispersed the rebels with false promises. However, the uprising sent shockwaves through the nation and cracked the facade of noble invincibility. Gradually, incrementally, the old feudal system began to crumble. The Black Death had decimated the population, making labor more valuable. Peasants could demand higher wages and more rights. The growth of towns and trade gave rise to a new middle class of artisans and merchants who chafed at the rigid social hierarchy. The printing press would gradually spread new ideas and learning to the masses. However, these changes unfolded slowly over generations. Our blacksmith, who had lost his family to the plague, would not witness his children rise above their station. The farmer's son, returning haunted from war, could not foresee that his descendants would one day own their own plot of land. The wealthy lord and lady, ensconced in their keep, could not foresee a time when their privileges would be stripped away. For now, life continued as it always had. The sun rose and set, the seasons turned, and the peasants worked and endured. They found joy in small things, like a warm loaf of bread, a healthy child, and a village dance. They leaned on their faith to find meaning in their suffering and promise a better life in the world to come. And they clung fiercely to hope, that tiny, irrepressible spark that even the most difficult trials could not extinguish. As you drift off to sleep, cozy in your modern bed, take a moment to reflect on the hardships and small joys of those who came before. Their strength, resilience, and unbreakable spirit in the face of unimaginable challenges. The slow march of progress, hard fought and still unfinished. And the shared human experience that binds us across the centuries. The love, loss, struggle, and triumph that define our mortal condition. Let their stories settle into your dreams. A reminder of how far we've come and how much farther we have yet to go. Rest now and sleep soundly, knowing that you are part of an ongoing human story rich in complexity and meaning. Good night. The blacksmith's loss was just one small part of the greater tragedy unfolding across the continent. As the plague intensified its gruesome harvest, fear and desperation gripped the hearts of both the rich and the poor. The Mana Lord barricaded himself and his family inside their stone keep, leaving the peasants to fend for themselves. He ordered his men-at-arms to shoot any peasant who dared approach the gates seeking aid. The once bustling manor courtyards now stood eerily silent, save for the anguished cries of dying whales and the creaking of death carts. The plague had struck down everyone, from the lowest fields to the Lord's own daughter, a dainty maid of 16 who succumbed to the fever within days. As the Black Death raged on, fields lay overgrown with weeds, and there were no one left to till the soil or bring in the harvest. The Lord watched helplessly from his tower as his wealth and power crumbled along with the bodies of his people. What good was his title and estate now, with no one to work the land or pay rents and tithes? The plague had drained his coffers and left his larders bare. But even the Lord's plight paled in comparison to the suffering of the common folk. Those who had managed to avoid the contagion's icy grip faced a slower demise as famine began to stalk the land. With the fields untended and grain stores depleted, the spectre of starvation now replaced disease as the peasant's chief tormentor. Bellies swollen and skin drawn tight over bones, they scoured the barren landscape for any scrap of sustenance. Leather shoes were boiled into a foul grass, and bark was mixed with precious handfuls of flour to make bitter bread. Alas, these desperate measures only delayed the inevitable for most. A mercifully quick death from plague gave way to the slow, wasting agony of hunger. Many took their own lives rather than endure the searing ache in their gut and the sight of their children's sunken, lifeless eyes. But even in these darkest of times, there were those who clung to hope, however meager. Throughout this calamity, the local parish priest remained steadfast in his ministry, risking contagion to offer last rites and comfort to the dying. When the plague claimed the blacksmith's beloved wife and children, it was the priest who dug their graves and whispered the prayers that would guide them to eternal rest. When the blacksmith collapsed to his knees in anguish, cursing the cruelty of the deity who would inflict such suffering, it was the priest who gently consoled him. With a hand on the blacksmith's trembling shoulder, the clergyman spoke of the mysteries of the Lord's will and the promise of reuniting with lost loved ones in the afterlife. It was cold comfort to the blacksmith's shattered heart. However, in time, the priest's compassion and unwavering service would indeed ignite something within him. Not joy, but perhaps the flicker of faith and resilience necessary to persevere despite all the suffering and loss. Day by day, the blacksmith emerged from his forge to assist the priest in tending to the sick and burying the deceased. Side by side, the two men fought to keep the embers of hope alive, even as the plague reached its peak. Months blurred into years, and gradually the Black Death began to loosen its grip. The number of the sick decreased, and the death carts no longer rolled through the town. Slowly and tentatively, life resumed its normal rhythms. For the blacksmith and the other survivors, the world was forever changed. The wounds of loss still raw and gaping, yet they had endured the unimaginable and now looked to the future with the hard-won wisdom of those who had faced death head-on. Just as the people began to glimpse a return to some semblance of normalcy, a new trial emerged on the horizon. Word spread of escalating tensions between the kings of England and France. The peace that had prevailed for generations was shattered as ancient rivalries, feudal obligations, and dynastic squabbles erupted into open warfare. The 100 Years' War had begun. For the battle-weary peasants, the eruption of hostilities between the crown and nobility was a distant concern, far removed from the immediate demands of their hand-to-mouth existence. After all, what did it matter which high-born lord sat upon a gilded throne when you spent your days coaxing stubborn oats from the rocky soil? However, the war would not remain distant for long. Soon enough, the feudal levy would arrive, compelling every able-bodied man to fight and potentially die for their lord's ambitions. On a crisp autumn morning, the blacksmith was at his forge, diligently hammering out a new plowshare for the neighboring farmer. His calloused hands gripped the tongs as he plunged the glowing iron into the water barrel, releasing a hissing cloud of steam. Immersed in his craft, he almost missed the commotion outside, the jangle of harnesses, the snorting of war horses, and the murmur of a gathering crowd. Setting down his tools, the smith emerged from the dimly lit forge, shielding his eyes from the sudden brightness. At the edge of town, a sight that made his stomach churn with dread. A column of armored knights on horseback, their surcoats adorned with the manor lord's crest. Behind them, a contingent of foot soldiers armed with pikes and crossbows. They were here to collect the young men of the village and march them off to fight for their lord and land. The blacksmith scanned the ashen faces of the gathered peasants, finally settling on a gangly youth near the front of the crowd. His apprentice, the boy who had come to him orphaned and starving 5 years ago, whom he had nurtured, clothed and trained in the secrets of metalcraft. With a pang, the smith recalled his own son, who had passed away so long ago from plague. He had hoped to one day pass on the forge to his own flesh and blood, finding a surrogate son in the apprentice he had discovered. This was a way to keep the trade alive and find meaning and purpose in the wake of losing his family. Now the war would claim the boy too. Another loss in a life that had already known too much of it. The blacksmith met his apprentice's frightened, eager days, seeing the boys yearning to run and hide from the knight's steely summons. But they both understood the futility of defiance or flight. With a heavy heart, the blacksmith stepped forward and drew the trembling youth into a swift, hard embrace. "Be brave," he whispered fiercely as he released the boy to join the conscripts assembling before their man, who would soon be knighted. "Pay attention to your training. Stay sharp." He pressed a small amulet of the Blessed Virgin into the boy's palm, a final token against the unimaginable dangers that lay ahead. "I'll pray for your safe return." The youth nodded silently, fingers curling around the amulet as he straightened his narrow shoulders and moved to take his place among the ranks of doomed young men. The blacksmith stood helpless, fists clenched as he watched the knights hear their charges away, leading them down the muddy track that would take them to whatever distant battlefield awaited. As the clatter of hooves and rasp of feet faded, the smith turned back to his forge, suddenly cold despite the still smouldering coals in the hearth. In the ringing silence that followed, the emptiness of the years ahead seemed to yawn before him. There were no children to raise, no legacy to nurture, no one to work alongside as he battled age and arthritis at the anvil. For a moment, grief and futility rose up to choke him. But then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he shook off the despair that threatened to claim him. He was no stranger to hardship and loss. None of them were. Not after the plague and the lean times that followed. Surrender was a luxury he could ill afford. There was work to be done, always more work. He was needed, perhaps more now than ever. With a newfound sense of purpose, the blacksmith kindled the flames to a steady roar and took up his hammer once more. If he couldn't fight for king and country, then he would serve in his own way by forging the tools and implements that would help his neighbors coax life from the yielding earth, that would rebuild some semblance of the world they had lost. One horseshoe, one hoe, one harrow at a time, he would do his part to knit this fractured land back together. It was a small role, perhaps, but a vital one nonetheless. As the war raged on, year after bloody year, the blacksmith barely allowed himself to think of his apprentice, the horrors the boy must be witnessing on some distant battlefield. News from the front was sporadic and seldom uplifting, bringing devastating English victories, the humiliating surrender of the French king, and the scourge of marauding free companies that ravaged the land in the aftermath of the army's departure. The smith could only pray that the boy's skills honed under his own rigorous tutelage would be enough to keep him alive, to repair the armor and weapons of his comrades, and to shoe the destriers and courses of his knightmasters. And on the rare occasion he allowed himself to imagine the boy's return, he envisioned the apprentice stepping up to the anvil, no longer a callow youth, but a man tested by the crucible of war, ready to assume his rightful place as master of the forge. However, such thoughts were a dangerous indulgence, a distraction from the ceaseless toil of the present. And so the blacksmith poured himself into his labors, the hammer ringing from dawn to dusk as he crafted the humble tools of sustenance and survival. The seasons turned, peace ebbed and flowed, and still the smith endured, his once strong back bent from years hunched over the anvil, his gnarled hands speckled with burns and scars. Until one evening, as he banked the coals and prepared to shut the forge for the night, a shadow fell across the doorway. The smith turned, his heart catching in his throat as he beheld the figure silhouetted there, taller and broader than he remembered, clad in a stained gambeson and rusted mail, yet unmistakably the apprentice, or rather the young man he had become. Standing on the threshold, his eyes haunted and searching in the dying light of the forge, the young man gazed at the smith. For a long moment, the two simply stared at each other, tears glistening in the smith's rheumy eyes, a tentative smile tugging at the soldier's chapped lips. Then, in a sudden rush, the young man crossed the earth floor in 2 great strides and fell into his master's embrace. The years, miles, and untold sorrows melted away in the comforting safety of the old man's arms. There would be time later to tell tales and reckon with all that had passed. The smith knew that the scars his apprentice carried were more than skin deep, and that the road ahead would be far from smooth. But for now, it was enough to know that he had come back. Despite the war and the world's cruelties, this one small thread of hope had not been cut. That night, as the forge fires cooled to embers and the 2 men sat to a humble supper of brown bread and bitter ale, the blacksmith marveled at the quiet resilience of the human spirit. They had all endured so much in this hard land, this unforgiving age. The ravages of plague, the deprivations of famine, the brutality of war and oppression. Yet through some unfathomable alchemy of hope and tenacity, life went on. In the face of the apprentice he had thought lost forever. In the shelter of the forge that had been his anchor through so many storms, the smith felt a flicker of something suspiciously akin to optimism stirring in his chest. The world was changing slowly but inexorably. The old certainties of crown and manor were giving way to something new, something that promised a measure of hope to even the lowest serf. Perhaps, just perhaps, the sacrifices and hardships of generations past would prove the raw material from which a better future might be forged. It was a fragile hope, to be sure, but like the apprentice sleeping now by the hearth, it was one he would nurture and guard, knowing all too well how easily such flames could be snuffed out. As the blacksmith banked the coals one last time and shuffled off to his pallet, he offered up a silent prayer of gratitude for the roof above his head, the food in his belly, and the safe return of his apprentice from the moor of war. In a world fraught with uncertainty and the constant presence of suffering and loss, these small mercies held immeasurable value. For this one night at least, he would cherish them, a beacon of hope against the hardships that undoubtedly awaited him. Life, as it had always been, and would continue to be, would persist, a testament to the indomitable spirit of those who labored, struggled, loved, grieved, and dared to hope in the face of the cruel yet beautiful world. In the end, perhaps that was enough to have lived, to have survived, and to have contributed to the grand tapestry of human resilience. Let the nobles revel in their castles and glories, for the humble blacksmith and his apprentice found a different kind of triumph in the simplest acts of perseverance. Through tending the land, mending what was broken, and passing on their knowledge to the next generation, they would forge a legacy all their own, one not born of the heat of battle, but in the quiet, steadfast labor of a life well lived. As the blacksmith drifted into a dreamless sleep, he found solace in the knowledge that come what may, he and his kind would endure, as steadfast and unyielding as the turning of the seasons, as eternal as the iron from which they crafted their purpose and hope. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, as it had always been. Yet they would confront it with the same stubborn strength that had carried them this far, and in the end, that would be enough. As the sun began its gradual descent, casting a golden glow across the manor's fields, the weary laborers exhaled a collective sigh of relief. Another day of arduous labor was drawing to a close. They gathered their rudimentary tools, sight-hides, hoes, and rakes, and embarked on the long journey back to their humble homes. Among them was a young boy, barely in his teenage years, whose hands bore the marks of years of working the land, calloused and rough from the toil. He yearns for a life beyond the confines of the manor, captivated by tales of burgeoning towns and the opportunities they offer for skilled tradespeople. Yet, bound by the invisible chains of the feudal system, he remains trapped in this land. As he trudges home, he passes the blacksmith's forge, the furnace's heat a searing wave that hits him. He pauses, captivated by the blacksmith's rhythmic hammering, the man's muscles rippling as he shapes red-hot metal into tools and weapons. A pang of envy grips him, what he wouldn't give to possess a trade that could break free him from this life of servitude. But such dreams are futile. Born a serf, he will die a serf. His life is not his own, it belongs to the lord of the manor. With a sigh, he resumes his journey. At home, his family has gathered around a meager dinner, a thin, bland meal of barley and vegetables. His younger siblings cry, their bellies aching with hunger. His mother tries to comfort them, but her efforts are futile. The harvest was poor this year, and the Lord has taken his share, leaving them with barely enough to survive. Exhausted, the boy slumps down and begins to eat. The meal is tasteless, almost bland, but it's all they have. He yearns for the lavish feasts enjoyed by the Lord and his family in the manor house. He has heard stories of roasted meats, exotic spices, and decadent desserts. His mouth waters at the thought, but he quickly pushes it away. Such things are not for him. As the family eats in silence, a sudden commotion outside draws their attention. Shouts and screams echo through the village. The boy's father leaps to his feet and rushes to the door, followed closely by the boy. Outside, the village is in chaos. People are running, their faces etched with terror, and then he sees it, a cart piled high with bodies. The plague doctor walks alongside it, his beaked mask and dark robes a terrifying sight. The boy's blood runs cold. The Black Death has descended upon their village, and panic grips the boy's heart as he turns to his father, seeking reassurance and a way out of this nightmare. But his father's face is grim, his eyes filled with a resigned hopelessness. They both know there is no escape. The plague is here, and it will take its toll. In the days that follow, the village descends into a living hell. The sick and dying are everywhere. their bodies covered in oozing black buboes. The stench of death hangs heavy in the air. The boy watches helplessly as his friends and neighbors succumb to the disease. He prays fervently, begging God to spare his family, but his prayers go unanswered. First, it takes his younger sister, her tiny body racked with fever and pain. Then his mother, who spends her last days caring for the sick, catches the plague herself. Finally, his father, a man who had always seemed so strong and invincible, wastes away before his eyes. The boy is left alone, a survivor in a village of ghosts. The fields lay out, the livestock dead or dying. The Lord is nowhere to be seen, having fled to his country estate to escape the plague. The boy feels a surge of bitter resentment. They've been left to die, abandoned by those who were supposed to protect them. But even in the depths of his grief and despair, the boy knows he must go on. He must honor the memory of his family, of all those who were lost. He will rebuild and survive. It's all he can do. As the weeks pass, the plague loosens its grip on the village. The death carts come less frequently, and the cries of the mourners grow quieter. The boy emerges from his home, blinking in the sunlight. The world looks different now, harsher and crueler, but he is different too, hardened by loss and suffering, yet also stronger and more resilient. He looks out over the empty fields, the abandoned homes. He knows it will take years to recover from this devastation, but he also knows that life goes on. The seasons will change, the crops will grow again, and he will tend to the land, just as his father and grandfather did before him. The boy sets out to work, his steps heavy but determined. He is a surfer bound to this land, yet he is also a survivor, and in that he finds a kind of freedom. This freedom is the ability to endure and carry on in the face of unimaginable hardship. It may be a small victory, but in this harsh world it is enough. As the boy works, his mind wanders to the future. He knows that life will continue to be difficult, with more hardships and losses. The feudal system that binds him is unlikely to change anytime soon. Yet he can't help but hold on to a glimmer of hope. He thinks of the stories he's heard of peasant revolts in other parts of the country, of surfers who have risen up against their lords demanding better treatment and more rights. He knows such talk is dangerous, that it could lead to severe punishment or even death. But still, the idea sparks something within him. Maybe, just maybe, change is possible. Maybe one day, surfers like him will be able to own their own land and reap the rewards of their labor. Maybe one day, education will not be limited to the wealthy and the clergy, but available to all. Maybe one day, the rigid social hierarchy that keeps him at the bottom will crumble. The boy shakes his head, dismissing these thoughts as foolish dreams. He must focus on the present, on surviving each day as it comes. And yet the dreams linger, a tiny flame of hope in a world of darkness. As the sun begins to set, the boy looks up from his work. He takes a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool evening air. Despite everything, there is still beauty in this world. The colors of the sunset, the rustle of the wind through the trees, the distant laughter of children playing. He thinks of his family, of the love they shared despite the hardships they faced. He thinks of the moments of joy that punctuated their difficult lives. The celebrations of harvest time, weddings and births, and the serene moments of contentment around the hearth. These are the things that make life worth living, even in the darkest of times. They provide him with the strength to persevere. The boy turns his face to the darkening sky, offering a silent prayer. He prays for the souls of the departed, for the strength to endure, and for a better future, however distant it may seem. Then he gathers his tools and embarks on the long walk home. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and struggles, but for now he will rest. And in his dreams perhaps he will glimpse that better world, that glimmer of hope that keeps him going day after difficult day. As the boy's figure fades into the gathering dusk, we are reminded of the enduring strength of the human spirit. Throughout history, people have faced unimaginable adversity, including war, disease, oppression, poverty, and yet they have persevered. They have found ways to adapt, survive, and even thrive. The story of this young serf is a testament to the resilience and fortitude that is innate to the human condition. It is a story of countless individuals throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. In our modern times, we face our own challenges, but we can draw inspiration from those who came before us. We can learn from their strength in the face of adversity and their ability to find hope in the darkest of circumstances. As we go about our daily lives with our modern comforts and conveniences, it's easy to forget the struggles of those who came before us. However, their stories are a part of our collective history, a reminder of where we've come from and what we're capable of overcoming. So let us honor their memory, not just of the serfs and peasants of medieval Europe, but of all those throughout history who have endured hardship and suffering. Let us learn from their strength and resilience, and strive to create a world where such suffering is lessened, where opportunity and freedom are available to all. As we lay down to sleep, let us spare a thought for the young serf who toiled in the fields of Amanna long ago. Let his story serve as a reminder to be grateful for our blessings and to never cease striving for a better, more just world. After all, that is the legacy we can all aspire to leave, a world that is a little bit better than the one we inherited. A world where the dreams of that young serf and the dreams of all who followed him can finally be realized. So, dear listener, let the cares and troubles of the day fade away. May your dreams be filled with that better world we all strive for, that glimmer of hope that guides us through even the darkest of times. As the sun sets on another day in this medieval village, the blacksmith finally allows himself a moment of rest. He sits heavily on a worn wooden bench outside his forge, his calloused hands clasped together, his head bowed in exhaustion and grief. The loss of his wife and children to the plague weighs heavily on his heart, a burden he will carry for the rest of his days. The village settles into its nightly routine. The livestock are brought in from the fields, their longing and bleating filling the air. Smoke rises from the thatched roofs as the women prepare the evening meal over open hearths. Children chase each other through the muddy streets, their laughter a fleeting moment of joy in an otherwise bleak existence. The blacksmith raises his eyes to the darkening sky, watching as the first stars appear. He reflects on his life, on the twists of fate that brought him to this moment. Born a serf, he was fortunate to be apprenticed to the village blacksmith, to learn a trade that would grant him a small measure of freedom and status. However, even that came at a cost. Long hours of back-breaking labor, burns and scars from the forge, and the constant struggle to make ends meet. And now the plague has taken even that meager comfort from him. His family, his reason for living, gone in a matter of days. He grapples with the daunting task of finding the strength to confront the uncertain future that looms ahead. As if in response to his musings, the village priest approaches him. The elderly man extends a gentle hand on the blacksmith's shoulder, his weathered face radiating compassion. "Have faith, my son," he whispers softly. "The Lord tests us, but he also provides us with the strength to endure." The blacksmith nods, drawing in a shaky breath. He acknowledges the priest's wisdom. He has persevered through this ordeal by sheer willpower, taking one step at a time, even when all seemed lost. He resolves to honor his family's memory by continuing to live, work, and hope for a brighter tomorrow. With a final pat on the shoulder, the priest departs, making his way through the village to offer solace and prayers to the other survivors. The blacksmith watches him go, feeling a small warmth spread through his chest. He realizes he is not alone. He understands that they are all in this together. The farmers, the craftsmen, the surfers, and the freemen, all struggling to make a living in this harsh and unforgiving world. He rises to his feet, his body aching with fatigue. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and sorrows, but for now he finds solace in the simple pleasures of life, a warm fire, a full belly, and the companionship of his fellow villagers. It may not be much, but it is enough. It must be. As the blacksmith makes his way to his solitary cottage on the outskirts of the village, we zoom out, capturing the scene one last time. The flickering torches, the hunched figures making their way home, and the palpable sense of a community bound together by hardship and resilience. This scene has played out countless times over the centuries, a testament to the enduring human spirit. And so we leave this medieval world behind, our hearts heavy with the knowledge of the suffering and struggle that defined daily life for so many. Yet we also leave with a sense of awe and respect for those who came before us, for their courage and determination in the face of unimaginable odds. As you drift off to sleep, let your thoughts linger on the blacksmith and his village. picture the quiet strength that sustained them through the darkest times, the flickering hope and humanity that shone through even the bleakest circumstances. Remember that their legacy lives on in us, in the resilience and compassion we carry within our hearts. Thank you for joining me on this journey through medieval history. I hope it has instilled in you a newfound appreciation for the comforts and freedoms we often take for granted. It has also deepened your understanding of the human experience that unites us all. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to our channel for more soothing and educational content that will help you relax and drift off to sleep. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with the quiet strength and enduring spirit of those who came before us. Good night.